that are we also thinking about what's happening, not directly within the church setting, but with some of the people that we are working with. So my talk today is primarily going to be exploring that, and also how can we practically do this? Because we've, I think the very, very emotional, I could feel the real emotion that was in the room after Matthew spoke and Father Roger spoke. And I think we then have to capitalise that. And the workshop that I was in, it was about that. So what do we do? What next? And also, what are some of the tools that we can help? And that's why the workshops are brilliant, because they start to think about what are the tools that we can do our job better with the people that we need to do it with. So these will be some of the themes that we'll explore today. I'm not going to answer this question, but I want you just to think about within your remit as safeguarders within the church. What is actually the most likely scenarios? Because I think we've got, when Stewart Allardyce, my colleague, gave the talk last year, he brought, he drew on some of the research that's been around about clerical abuse and about abuse, the sexual abuse scandals within the church. And after that, we reflected. We met with colleagues from our local diocese, St Andrews in Edinburgh, and we reflected on, is that the only way we are going to look at safeguarding? Because there is some, there's been lots of really good work done around that. I've got a slide which I don't need to show you. It's your own safeguarding standards, which really cover that angle. But I wonder if we need to expand how we think about this area. So I'll come back to this at the end, once we've gone through what do we know about the context of child sexual abuse, at this moment. So what I'm going to look at quickly, and I'm aware of the time that people will be cracking on, and I very much see this as the start of a conversation. And one of the areas that we're hoping is that you will all use the Lucy Faithfull Foundation as a partner agency within this. Because if this was easy to prevent, we would have prevented it by now. If it was sorted in an hour and there was only one thing we needed to pay attention to, we would have done that by now. So what I want to look at today is just what's some of the current thinking around safeguarding. And I've got no answers about how you apply that within your settings, but I think we've all got work to do. And all the partner agencies that we work with, there's a real open-heartedness to do that work. And perhaps admit that some of the compartmentalised ways we look at abuse, is it institutional, is it within the family, is it online, is it in our communities, when the reality is it's usually all of those, mixed together. So what I'm going to explore is a wee bit about what do we know about child sexual abuse and where it's happening just now, and who are the abusers and how is that landscape changing. Matthew covered some of this around, what are some of the barriers to disclosure? Because the skills we can learn that we can help facilitate that. And when I don't know if we went to the same party at some point, but we've nearly got, I wasn't able to join the planning for this. We've got nearly the same, the same quote. So we were obviously thinking some of the same things around this idea of bystanders. What is it about cultures that enables people not to speak out? Because that's an active thing as well. If you don't speak out, you're actually making a choice there, as much as if you do speak out. But there's institutional and cultural matters that I think we all need to think about. And within that, there's also key things, and I think these are skill issues, and Matthew certainly touched on that. I think a key area is this identification of child sexual abuse. Now, there's a report that I'll touch on, but what I'm seeing when I go into different organisations, and this includes the police, social work, and all institutions, that somehow we've developed protocols and procedures that are premised on the fact that somehow it's the child's responsibility to come forward and tell us that they're being abused by a certain person, and then we click into action and we stop that. That just doesn't work. It so rarely works. In Matthew's account of his own abuse, I think absolutely exemplifies, why that doesn't work. It's really complicated, but I think we need to, there's then a skill. What are we looking for, and what we need to do then, if we're not relying on a verbal disclosure, we need to see, we need to listen with our eyes. What is it we're looking out for that's telling us that something's going on that we need to think more carefully about and begin to wonder, is this the early sign of something that we need to do something about? So we'll look at that. And similarly with actual abusers, whenever we quote statistics about undisclosed sexual abuse or sexual abuse in our community, there's always an abuser connected to that. And I'll come on to under disclosure, because that's it's an area that it never ceases to quite rightly to shock me when I look at this. And we'll come on to that, the meaning of that, because again, if we think that all instances of child sexual abuse eventually justice is done and the authorities are informed and people are prosecuted, that is way off the mark. It's scarily way off the mark. So we need to think about what's the meaning for that in our job when we still have to work with people who maybe don't reach the evidential threshold for the police to be involved or for social work to be involved. And the statistics around that are quite scary. Related to that is something that's been called low-level concerns or neutral notifications. It's the idea that there's always a build-up to events, and we need to get more thoughtful about recognising, what are the signs that things are beginning to go wrong, and that's both within children and within perpetrators, because abuse doesn't just happen. There's a build-up, there's a function for it for the individual that's abusing, and there's signs that we can step in earlier. And the earlier we can step in, the better we can prevent abuse, rather than, as I say, going back to relying on a child who's already been abused to tell us that something's going wrong, and then we step in. So the low-level concerns part I'll come to, and that's quite a practical thing. And crucially at the end is just to share some, this is very difficult, and as Matthew said, your role within your churches and parishes, you're not investigators, you're not police officers, you're not social workers. So but it's still also to refer on, and to do that appropriately, you need to gather, you need to make good referrals so that the next stage happens. But often things might be bounced back. A prosecution might not happen. The threshold for social work might not happen, but you'll still be there working with the families and the children. So it's to be thoughtful about that. And that's a very difficult thing to do. And that's why there are lots of organisations and resources, practical things around support about how do you collate information if you're beginning to think there's something going wrong with a child within your parish, and how's that recorded and shared so that when you do have enough information, you can pass that on. So again, this was just to say that, there's a great foundation, I think, and I see that within all our organisations. And I think we mentioned last year that the one thing that certainly come out of the child abuse scandals is a real overhauling of safeguarding. And I think, all of this, within this, is the foundations for really, really good work. And similarly, within the safeguarding standards. And I see some of the practical things that we can do, certainly around training and support for those responsible for safeguarding, because some of this, I think, is about upskilling people, because, as I say, because the way our systems have been set up, I think we sometimes we were expecting one thing when we should have been looking for another thing. So I think it's all there within the safeguard. What we have to make sure is that that's translated into reality, and that if parishes are saying, we get very few safeguarding concerns, that would slightly worry me because of what we know about the extent of child sexual abuse. And some of those might be low-level concerns. So we need to think about how are we collating information so that we can build a case when we refer on to other organisations. There's something here as well, and this is not to say that you're never off duty or that any of us are never off duty if we have these roles within organisations, but I was working alongside Sports Scotland recently, and they had the term in sport abuse and out of sport abuse, because they recognise that their organisations, and I think it's the same with your churches, are often a haven for people who are being abused in other settings. And so I think there's something there that we need to think about, that not just to limit our curiosity and not to limit the way we think about child sexual abuse. And even though I'm talking about child sexual abuse, this applies to all safeguarding issues. I think we have the privilege of working often with very vulnerable people. And with that privilege comes the responsibility for us to be brave and curious. And one of the themes that I've been hearing when I speak to parishes is that one of the consequences of, and it's a really unfortunate consequence of the abuse scandals within the church, has been a standing back and a pulling back from relationships with parishioners. And that means that those relationships where disclosures might happen that have been impeded. And I think we need to think about brave ways to actually be stepping forward again and thinking, how do we, when I was growing up, priests were in and out of people's homes and they were integrated into every aspect of life. And I know that still happens in some cases, but when I speak to priests that have been around for a while, they'll say that's much less likely to happen. And with that loses the opportunity to spot what's going on within families, and that's a missed opportunity, I think. One area that no organisation has got their head around is the main locus of where child sexual abuse, and I've got some stats about that, is now online. How do our safeguarding procedures begin to think about that? We might know what's happening in somebody's living room, what's happening in the chat room that people are going on about, and how do we have a role within that? And I don't have the answers for these, but it's something I think we need to think about. This slide, I mean, it's just, this is something that I think you're all aware of. And in Matthew's account, as I say, exemplified this. The reason why we're all concerned about this is because the impact of child sexual abuse it's very individual, but it's often profound and lifelong. And so we just need to do our absolute best to ensure that that we're stopping this where we can. Apologies for this busy slide. There's an organisation that I would urge you to make use of. It's the Centre for Expertise for Child Sexual Abuse, and they're academics that take all the research and they put it into busy, noisy slides like this. But so we can get a sense of, well, what is the current state of child sexual abuse? From this slide, there's a couple of things I want to think about as well, if we're thinking about this idea of disclosure. If we look at the part where it says age where abuse started, what are we thinking about when we're thinking about a 4-year-old being sexually abused, or a 3-year-old, or even younger? That's very different from a 14-year-old or a 15-year-old. So again, if we are setting up systems that somehow there's going to be a conversation where a child tells us something, we're kidding ourselves when we think that a considerable proportion of child sexual abuse happens to children under the age of 8, where that awareness that there's actually something harmful may not yet have occurred. So we need to think about that within our system, and also pay attention to younger children within that. Just another couple of things before I focus in one particular area is the gendered nature of child sexual abuse, where men are primarily the perpetrators and girls are primarily the victims. Now, as Matthew said, that landscape is changing, and as we, there are a significant proportion of boys that are sexually abused, but it's not as many as children. And within the idea about boys being more abused within institutional settings, often a lot of that was about that girls were denied access to institutional settings. It may be all male boarding schools or certain roles within the church, for example, whereas now that that's changing and being much more open, we're actually seeing that statistic beginning to change. So there is a gendered element to this. But what we also shouldn't forget is that they think, the research, it's very difficult to pin this down, but up to 10% of child sexual abuse are they think possibly between 10 to 20, but we're really unclear, is perpetrated by women. So we have to have in our mind that it's not only men. And I'll come on to the next slide, which is particularly depressing as well, is that we're now at the stage where it's nearly up to 50% of child sexual abuse is committed by minors. And we need to really take that on board as well, that within our churches that we should. So back to that question I asked at the beginning, we need to it's not just men that we're thinking about, it's peer abuse. And when I was speaking to Sports Scotland about this, and they were telling me that their safeguarding procedures seem to have made great inroads into the abuse that coaches were perpetrating towards young sportswomen and young sportsmen. But what they hadn't anticipated was abuse coming from 17 and 18-year-olds to 13 and 14-year-olds, often with an online component. The theme of today is that this thrives in secrecy, and we need to talk about this. We need to be aware of this, but the internet facilitates secrecy because it's often quite hard to see what's actually happening. And this, where the rise in sexual abuse involving young people has been, as this slide shows, is online. And there's something unique about sexual abuse that we know it's as common as other types of abuse, but there's something about the stigma and the secrecy that leads it to not be reported. And there's something about that is often, unless you're skilled in identifying what the signs are, if a child is physically abused, you might see a broken arm or bruises. If a child's been sexually abused and isn't telling you, and not telling is part of the symptom of abuse, what are we looking out for then? If they're not going to say. So there's something about the nature of sexual abuse, and there's something about the way us as adults respond to this that somehow leads it to be underreported. And this is only about child protection plans, because the next, and this is just, again, apologies for the kind of busy slide. I suppose what I'd like people to take from this slide is that we're now up to nearly 50% of crime involving an online component. And similarly with domestic abuse, that now often has an online element to it around the coercion and abuse will not only be physical, but it will include an online element. So I think we all all of us involved in safeguarding need to think about this element. And this is just, as I was saying, it was a recent article in that teenagers are accused in half of child sexual abuse cases. And again, that's something, when we have a stereotype of who's committing abuse, we're not thinking about a 17-year-old boy, abusing someone. We're somehow still stuck. And that gets even pushed younger, as say, when we're talking about online abuse. And this, unfortunately, is a slide that I think depresses me more than anything else. This again is from the Centre of Expertise for Child Sexual Abuse, and this is the actual figures are from England and Wales. But I was speaking to colleagues in Childlight who operate at Edinburgh University, and they said this goes against all their good psychological research principles. But if you basically take a zero off that, you've got what happens in Scotland. So, and this is about every year. So we're thinking about 50,000 children a year in Scotland are being sexually abused. And out of those, I checked the figures for this, only around 200 of those get child protection plans for child sexual abuse. Only 10% of those are actually reported, and of those 10%, you're winnowing down to less than 1% are actually getting an input from the statutory services. So what that effectively means is that in every classroom, in every parish, there are children that are being sexually abused that no one knows about. So I suppose that lays a couple of responsibilities on all of us, is to do better about recognising, but also doing what you do best within your organisation, and about kindness and love, and the idea that disclosure is a process that can take years, and every time a child sees an adult, will listen to them or will be kind. That could be one step closer to that child at some point doing something. So, I mean, whenever I look at this, it just makes me realise how far we have to go in this area. So some of the key messages I think that we need to keep are that child abuse can be prevented. And it's a really difficult task because we were doing much better around things like abuse within institutions, and somehow the internet came up and brought a whole new arena that we haven't got our heads around. But if we invest time and energy in conferences like this and in training safeguarding staff, I mean, I had the pleasure of sitting in one of the first level of your safeguarding training, and I think it's really good because it just gets people to think about, this is about curiosity and noticing. And it's about noticing things when they're beginning to happen, rather than, we've all got great safeguarding policies if we do know that or if the police arrest someone, we'll click into action then, but we need to get better at picking up. 1 in 10, the figures about these are really difficult because we can't rely on recorded crime because that's such a tiny minority of what's happening. So often these are retrospective they call them victimization studies, where they ask adults about who was abused by who and when. And we know it's somewhere between 1 in 5 and 1 in 10, but we think within Scotland approximately 50,000 a year. It's very, very rarely reported at the time or discovered at the time. And what we need to think more about is abuse within families, abuse by teenagers, and abuse using technology. And all of you as safeguarders, you need to think, do your policies adequately reflect this? And the scary thought is just in your congregations, there are children currently being sexually abused that we're all not aware of. And there's also ones that are at risk of being sexually abused, because the previous slide showed that vulnerable children, disabled children, children that are care experienced, children that are from cultural and ethnic backgrounds where there's maybe not trust in institutions, are more likely to be sexually abused and are more likely not to disclose that abuse. So you can think of who's in the congregations, who are the people that are coming into your churches, because often they are vulnerable people. And if we are saying that vulnerable families are more likely to be abused than non-vulnerable families, but if we can all act together, because this is say if there was only one way to do this, we would have done it by now, and it's a really difficult thing to do, but there is support around there. So this is just a kind of summary thing. I won't dwell on this because I'm aware of time, but this is about sexual abuse in general. Then we'll look at abuse, we'll focus a wee bit on abuse within the family, that it's more common and it's underreported. There is no one stereotypical abuser. But what we know is that children, I think it's up to 90% of children are abused by somebody they know and trust. So the idea of stranger danger, which I think up until schools are much, much better at that now, but up until they did an interesting study. It was in New Zealand, and it was the idea of parents being involved in empowering their children to recognise who might be risky. And they found that parents were really good about bodily autonomy, safe touch, and all that area. But when it came to this idea of who's more likely to abuse your child, as Matthew said, he was abused by by his uncle, the parents skidded away and started talking about strangers and about men in vans, and don't speak to strangers in the shops. There was something very unpalatable and also something really scary. And also, this is not an easy thing to talk about because you don't want to spread seeds of suspicion within families if you don't have to. But the reality is that the children are much more likely to be abused by somebody they know than a stranger. And we just have to get that message across. Some children are more vulnerable than others. They don't tell. You don't have to be an expert to help. I think I was kind of sharing with someone in the break there that I used to work in the main psychiatric hospital in Edinburgh, and there was an interesting study there done around who's responsive to disclosures of child sexual abuse within the patient population in the hospital. And it wasn't the professionals, it wasn't the trained staff, because they were worried somehow that they were going to open, the study was called a can of worms, because that was the phrase that was coming up. It was the cleaners and the unqualified night staff, because they were the ones that were just listening. They weren't trying to solve it. They pass that information on, but there's you don't have to be an expert to help, is what I'm saying, that we can all play a role within this. Parents and carers are key in terms of, who we might work with, and also that recovery is possible, that's the message of hope, that the earlier we can identify and work with this, the better the outcomes. So within a family, as I was saying, it can be anyone within a family, relatives, foster carers, friends. One of the areas that, again, is very unrecognised is sibling abuse. And that's an area that's it's more likely to be not disclosed within the family if the abuse has been within siblings. Say mostly males, and also with no formal convictions. That's the same. One of the outcomes of the inquiry into child abuse in Australia within faith organisations was that screening and disclosures wouldn't have picked up the majority of abuse because most people hadn't any previous convictions for sexual abuse. So even though we need to keep doing our disclosure checks, that's really important. But again, that's not all we need to do. We need to think about this much more comprehensively. As I was saying, abuse within the family now, unfortunately, will often include an internet element that might be separate or might be related, that it will often co-occur with other types of abuse. If a child has been emotionally abused or physically abused, they're also more likely to be sexually abused, and vice versa with the other types of abuse. Within families, it often starts at a younger age and will continue for a longer period than out with families. The impact is individual but often extensive, underreported. And there's a particular link that we're exploring with Police Scotland just now, is one as I say, scary but workable with statistic, that a key link between non-disclosure of child sexual abuse is that they occur within families where there is domestic abuse, for all the reasons that we can imagine, that the children are already working within a coercive environment where secrecy is paramount. And so we are actually looking at how do police call-outs and how do social workers get better at thinking, yes, there's domestic abuse here, but what's also going on with the quiet children? So that's an area that we have taken forward with them. I'll let you read this in your own time. It's just about, there is no one definition of intrafamilial, family, within the family child sexual abuse, but that, it covers, it covers the areas. Again, I find this, 24 years is the average time between a child being abused and the child disclosing. And as Matthew said, I think for men it's even longer. So this is for both men and women. And I remember Stewart last year talked about that if the abuse happens within a church setting, it's actually even longer. Now, these are all the reasons why, that especially within the family, if most of the abuse is happening from people that they know and trust, you know, there's often a relationship of dependency there. And as Matthew said, there's, you know, children feeling responsible, not wanting to destroy families. And if they're very young, not understanding and that what's happening is wrong. And often there will be different levels of awareness of what's going on within families. Now, that's within a spectrum. Most of it is that family members are not fully aware, or they're not able to protect. If back to what I was saying about child sexual abuse, that compromises, you know, the partner's ability to protect children within that. So there's lots of reasons why within families there will be pressures within that. If children are just frightened, they won't be believed. Or if there's an intellectual disability, children with learning disabilities are much more likely to be sexually abused than, you know, children without. And that guilt and shame, you know, it silences children, feeling somehow that they're, as Matthew said, that they're somehow, you know, part of that they brought this on themselves by some activity, or that they deserved it. Often, if you're dealing, because I'm aware within, you know, the Catholic churches, we're often people visiting our churches have got English as a second language. That's another barrier as well, or just threats and intimidation. And Matthew, I think, brought a point that, you know, that's very important around LGBTQ plus matters. That if that's part of it, if a young person is beginning to question their own sexuality and then has concerns about how that might be received within the family or within the church, that can be a further barrier to preventing and disclosure. And just loneliness and isolation, because trauma isolates people. You know, as you're just fighting to survive, or you don't have the reserves or the energy to make connections. So lots of reasons why disclosure doesn't happen. But enablers of disclosure are, it increases with age. So as I said, you know, younger children will really struggle to disclose, but as children get older, it seems, you know, the rates increase. If it's been an adult perpetrator, children are more likely to disclose than if it's been a peer. So that's something for us to bear in mind. Given what I was saying, that the area where child sexual abuse is increasing is within you know, young people. It's easier for the reasons I said before, for someone who's been abused to disclose if the perpetrator's not related, and if they trust adults and services. And I was saying communities that maybe feel disenfranchised or not fully integrated, you know, into society will struggle more to disclose. It can often be memorable life events. Like we certainly work with lots of people where, as I was saying, it's often within adulthood is the time where disclosure will happen. And it might be having a child, you know, a woman having a child themselves. That'll say, and as Matthew, is the abuser still out there? What can we do now about that? The use of social media has been really positive around communities supporting disclosure, you know, within that, and getting support for that. So it's not all grim about social media. There's some really important things that I think we could all be more aware of, because, you know, I'm, you know, not in the first flush of youth looking around here. I'm in good company as well. And it often means that we won't be digital natives, as they call it. We won't be as connected or as reliant on social media. So there's good things about social media, because when it comes to disclosure, young people are often, as a first step, more likely to disclose online or to friends. And then it's, where does it go? Does it stop there? We want it to come to us so that adults can take some responsibility for what happens next. And also, our service models culturally appropriate? And also, as Matthew said, that, you know, the statistics seem to show not only are girls much more likely to be abused, but they're also more likely to disclose. So there's particular barriers that I know, you know, Matthew was referring to, both the way the courts view this, but also enabling males to come forward. it's this idea that disclosure starts before it starts. And what you've already all got is trusting relationships. And just to think about some of these ideas about, and I've got slides later, what is different about a child? What's unusual behavior? And this isn't about tapping every child on the shoulder and asking if they've been sexually abused. That wouldn't work. This is about viewing disclosure as a process that can often take years. And as I said before, every time we give a child a positive experience where adults can be trusted, they will listen, they will take the child seriously. They often say before, I was watching some therapeutic interventions with child with disclosure, and they'll test it out. They might tell you one thing about themselves. It might be something. There was a child I remember that one of my colleagues worked with, and the first thing it was a teacher they were beginning this process with. And the first thing they said, "I've been shoplifting." And they were trying to see how would the teacher react to that? Would the teacher immediately say, "Well, that's it, I'm calling the police"? That's the end of that. And that child was testing out what that response might be. So you have to, just be patient with this and be available and, have trusting relationships. And as I say, that we're, as was in many of the workshops, our job is just, if someone then does start to talk to us about this, then our job is not to investigate this. It's just to hear what the child says, and then to think, well, that doesn't seem like a full disclosure. Discuss it with your colleagues. Is that just information that you're, beginning to build up about? There's something going on here that this child or young person wants to say to me. And just watching that process, and it may take years, just seeing how that unfolds. And then crucially, as you said, when to refer on and when to signpost. But the referring on part seems to be not particularly successful, as we're saying. If only a tiny amount of the children being abused disclosed, and then a tiny amount are actually worked with by statutory services. So if we can be kind and loving within what we are doing, then hopefully, we're facilitating that, and with the end result that there will be more people we can refer on. This report was particularly profound. When I started my post a year ago, this report came out in November, and it was called "I Wanted Them All to Notice." And it was the Children's Safeguarding Practice Review Panel report, and it was quite damning of all services that were working with children for some of the reasons that I've begun to talk about. Systems relying on children disclosing, thresholds for services acting being way too high. When they took testimonies from adults that abused as children, the unique factor was, I wanted somebody to ask me. I was behaving in a way that suggested something wasn't right. I wanted them all to notice. So that there is something going on here that we as safeguarders need to think, more about. And it's a skill, and I'll go into that in some detail. What the 5 key findings from that report were, and I'm going to focus on 2 of them. We could, some because they're less relevant to your role, I think, but some of them just because we don't have time to cover all of them. One was about, and this was about services that there were often qualified staff, health visitors, social workers. They weren't identifying the signs and understanding what the risks were and raising concerns. And if that's qualified staff that allegedly have some training, what about us that have volunteered for safeguarding roles? Some of us might come from backgrounds within the police, within social work, within health, that might give us some skills, but this was about qualified staff. But you can do something about that. If there's a lack in the ability to identify signs, then there's training that you can, that can increase that skill. The other was about speaking and listening to children. Again, these were services that were meant to be trained within that. There was something about children not being believed often, or having conversations that just wasn't allowing the child to tell the story, or if the child wasn't directly saying "I've been sexually abused," case closed. Rather than thinking there's a process here, this child is starting to tell me something, but it might take a while. So that was an important part. And about parents' vulnerability, the prime example is related to domestic abuse, not understanding why some parents really struggle to protect within these settings. And if there's been other abuse within the family, that compromises that, you know, I mean, it adds to that cycle of feeling compromised. Risk assessments, that was more for formal staff, but I think there's something within organisation, any organisation, you know, you have your DRAMPs within that, thinking about when a threshold's reached within that for action to be taken. And there was something about how to effectively respond to central familial sex abuse systems relying on children's disclosure. That's the link for that. You'll get these slides. I'd really urge you to read that report because it's very profound. So there's something going on here then around how this particular type of abuse affects us as adults. And I say, Matthew and I were obviously at the same party where Elie Wiesel attended and gave us some very profound quotes. When I attended this conference last year, and then I also attended the Cross of the Moment online sessions, one of the themes was about the added hurt for survivors from the way the church responded. So there's something about what they call the bystander effect, again, that we can do something about. So it's not just the cruelty of the actual abuse, it's about the adults that didn't. I wanted them all to notice, as that child said. There's something very powerful about when you're not noticed. Bystander effect, again, there's, you know, we'll come on to the end about if any of you are interested in, you know, because obviously 2 slides is not training in the bystander effect, it's just highlighting this. But there is something, I suppose there's some key elements there. There's something about the more people are around, the less likely we are to act as individuals. And there was a famous case, I think, in New York, I think it was Kitty Genovese, where lots of people were watching a young woman being assaulted, although there's now some controversy about the way that was written up, that it wasn't quite as it was. But there's lots of examples. I was looking at, there's some training that Middlesbrough University are doing where they gave some examples of if there were lots of people around, students were just walking past people in distress. And there's lots of elements to that. The more the scruffier somebody looked, the more likely they were to walk by. If it was a male, they were more likely to walk by than if it was a female. There's lots of different factors, but there is something about an inhibiting effect if we think it's not our job, or if we think someone else will do it, that seems to you know, impede us. Regarding child sexual abuse prevention, then it means we need to know what the signs are so that we can act. And that also needs to be within the culture of the organisation that we're rewarded for doing so. And that this is part of a conversation within the whole congregation. When we do this work within schools, the teachers have assemblies where they say to the children, we're going to do things differently. And they get advocates from within the sixth form to teach the younger kids about this. So it's a whole systems approach, so that it's not just adults coming in, and because you'll alienate families if you do that, and you'll alienate young people. So you need to think about whole church approaches and how you're going to do that. And these are not easy things. So there are programs, there is training, and you know, we can, you know, if anyone's interested, we could speak more about that later. You know, to train people to recognise situations, and also how do you take responsibility? What are some of the scripts? When we did this within library settings, they wanted scripts about what to say if they saw, because people were really unsure about it. But that really helped, and it increased library staff being able to intervene if they saw inappropriate behaviour. It was amongst teenagers within certain groups that were being run in libraries. Why, as I say, why people don't get involved? It's not, I'm not trained for that. A bit like I said in the hospital, I'm not opening the can of worms, or speak to the consultant when he's on a week on Tuesday. I can't speak about that. If you think it's not your job, it's not your responsibility. Or for us, this is really difficult stuff to talk about. We just don't want to go there. And that's why this is underreported. We don't want to make things worse. I think there is a fallacy that somehow if we speak to people about abuse, it makes it worse. The abuse has already happened. It can't be made worse by us talking about it, but there is that. It's similar to do with suicide, that there's that perception that somehow if you ask somebody if they're suicidal, you'll put that idea in their mind. The idea's already in their mind, and the abuse has already happened. That we don't feel safe about it, and that's about systems. So we need to know how we can set that up better, within safeguarding. That we don't know what to say. Again, we can be trained in that. We can think about that as organisations. No one likes confrontation, because it's difficult if you're not sure, and the child isn't going to tell you, so you're never going to be sure. How do you have these brave conversations in a way that may eventually lead to a disclosure? But there's just something in us, we don't want to get into other people's businesses, and we might think, that family, the rights of the family, they've got a right to do what they want to do within that family. Not if a child's being abused, because safeguarding is everybody's responsibility. Some of the things that within faith communities that we can do is shift social norms around this. Skill building, say there is training around warning signs and intervening. Encourage help-seeking behaviours. If as an organisation, the Catholic Church is, we're feeling bruised and battered around this, and there has been a stepping back, how do we step forward? I don't know what some of the answers are for this, but, and also think about your policies. Do they encourage engagement? And just for us to have how are we braver and more curious? This is a couple of slides just to show that, that this is a skill that we can build. Within signs, within children and young people that are being abused, we generally think about this. There will be emotional signs, there will be physical signs, and there will be behavioural signs. Now, I just put this in the slide just to show that these are some of the things that you can pay attention to, but this isn't training in this, and there is training that our organisation and other organisations involve around this, because it's a skill that you need to acquire. And just reading a slide, about all this isn't the same as acquiring that skill. But I suppose what we're saying, that there will, what are you seeing? What are you listening to with your eyes? How is that child acting in a way that will ring your alarm? What are the changes? Or what's that quiet child communicating? Now, I'll come on to that. Most of the time, I hope we're wrong, but if we're right, we've done a good thing. There will be physical signs. Now, these physical signs, I've put them up, but they're probably the signs that we're least likely to see. When I work alongside colleagues in health settings, these are often the things that health visitors may see, or different health professionals around that. We might see some of this, but this is less likely. But it's good to know about them, because it may come up at some, it may come up on some occasions. The ones that we're possibly most likely to see is some of the behavioural signs around that. That if you hear a child, for example, talking in a highly sexualised way that doesn't seem to be age appropriate, what's going on there with that child? What's in the background of that? Or, if you're hearing the young people that you're working with talking about, one child that seems to have changed behaviour and has suddenly become very promiscuous. What's that about? What's the meaning of that? What's that child communicating? What's happened to that child? And this is about, I had the pleasure recently of being part of a panel that was that had a private screening for a film called Love and Trouble. I don't know if anybody saw this at the festival. It was a film about a young woman who had been sexually abused, and again she wanted people to notice, and she was brought up and a deprived part of Fife, and the schools just wrote her off as behaviour, as just bad behaviour, rather than behaviour that was communicating that there was, that she was being sexually abused. Again, there's signs that you can recognise that a child may be being groomed by a particular adult. Again, this is a skill set that you can build on. And these are just some of the, when we deliver this training, some of this. But the crucial thing I want to say, that grooming can happen both with peers and adults. But if you observe relationships between peers or relationships between adults and children within your congregation, and bearing in mind it's most likely to be somebody that they know already, then think about that. And signs that an adult might pose a risk, it's about being more curious. Again, these are skills, the adult isn't going to look any different, and it is going to be someone that the child knows and trusts. So again, this is something that you can learn about. And when I was delivering this within sports settings, they were particularly aware of that, of children that there was a relationship between the high achieving children in sport and the likelihood of being sexually abused. They were often taken away and isolated, allegedly for training. These are, again, just some of the things. Now, again, these are not in isolation. With this slide and with the previous slide, I suppose there's a caution connected to that, is there's lots of reasons why children might behave in that way or might be exhibiting these. There might be reasons why adults are behaving this way, but it's beginning to think in this way, building your skills up, being curious, and also thinking that this is a possibility. There's something here about, as adults, if we don't act, because what we showed actually when they looked at studies and they spoke to responsible adults that had been around when children were later disclosing abuse, the adults were often saying, I thought something was going on and I didn't bring it up. I didn't have the courage. I didn't have the knowledge. So there is something we need to have a system then, if we think something might be going on and it might be low level, that we can begin to collate that information and think about it so that we know when the time is that we're going to act. And if we get it wrong, that I think that's fine, that's okay. And hopefully we will get it wrong. And if a child's quiet and, withdrawn, it might be their dog has just died, or something that explains that. But we need to be more curious, and we need to, because the times we get it right, we will have prevented or intervened around sexual abuse. This again, I've put a link in for that. This came out of the Jimmy Savile inquiry. Marcus Aruga, who was involved in that, and one of the things he saw was safeguarding, or safeguarders within organisations were really good if it was quite an obvious event, but policies around low-level concerns. Now, I'm aware, I think I've got, so there's a link to that. It's not the most gripping read, I might add, because it's a book about developing a policy, but it's a really important. And within Sports Scotland, we met with them and we kind of talked them through, and they've now got really comprehensive low-level concerns policies where that's across all their organisations about how do they, because some of that's difficult, because if you're recorded, there's GDPR issues and all of that's talked about within that document. So I would urge you, to think about that, because at the heart of this, of early identification of abuses, how do you record and think about that? Now, I took this off your organisation and I just came up with Form CM1. So you've got something there, but what I wasn't aware of within that is how's that collated and integrated, and how's that shared, and how's that used. I'll leave that for you to think about, the glorious CM1, and if it's something you've ever heard of, and if it's something that's used. So again, back to your policies and procedures, they include everything that you need. It's thinking, are you thinking wide enough, within this? So I suppose just to kind of wind things down, sorry. It's just this idea, coming from today, there's something about being brave, and, Matthew's organization called Brave. And so we need to be brave as well, as safeguarders, and curious and patient, because as I say, disclosure doesn't happen as ask a child, are you being sexually abused? The child says no, or the child come up to you and telling you. It's a process, and you need to think about how adequately your services cover that. But can it build in the learning? Because you've gone through the fire about child sexual abuse, and there's lots of knowledge there. And we need to think about how do we do that before it happens. But you've already got skills as safeguarders. And I think the training that I sat in on, I was really impressed about. And it is about relationships, and it is about empathy. And if we can't do that within a church setting, I don't know where we can do it. And being honest and all the skills that I see within organisations where I go. This is just what we can do, and there is the part I wanted to. There are training elements to that. You'll all get the slides, I understand, at the end of this. So this is just, what you can do. You can do what like all of us, we can all do what we do, but do it better. And that should be the kind of call to arms. This was just something, you've got so many opportunities. We've got so many parishes, we've got so many, priests and volunteers and safeguarders and people coming to the churches. There's lots of opportunities there. We just need to think, are we recognising them as best as we can? So just to finish, you're all doing a brilliant job within that. Safe adults and safe spaces are crucial to disclosure and prevention. But what we know is that we can't just rely on obvious cases, that it's hugely underreported. Pay attention. How are our policies thinking about peer abuse? How are we thinking about underreporting? This idea of inside and outside church. What about the internet? What do we do about that? And I don't have an answer about that. But just this idea of that abuse happens through incremental boundary violation. It doesn't happen out of the blue. And if we can spot it early, we can do something about it. So these are just some of the obvious colleagues that you can tap into. And I'll share, I'll kind of wind up now because I'm aware it's 4 o'clock. Us at the Lucy Faithfull Foundation, the NSPCC, Bernardo's and the Centre for Expertise, there's brilliant resources on there around these areas, speaking to children, disclosure, signs and indicators of sexual abuse, systems. There's such a lot of good work out there, but it's quite hard to access. So the Centre for Expertise does training. We offer training, NSPCC and Bernardo's. So I'm not contractually. There are other organisations out there. I'm saying this is difficult work, and we all need support with that. So I won't. I'm contractually obliged to show 3 slides about the Lucy Faithfull Foundation, but I won't dwell in it. But we are one of them, and we cover. And we've got a helpline. You can call us. It's confidential. It doesn't cost anything. It's for professionals like yourselves that are. So if you want to talk something through, as well as sharing it with your safeguarding peers and with with priests, with all the systems you've already got on board, we are also here for yourselves. And I won't dwell on that. Just to finish, that children are not going to come forward to stop this. We are going to stop this. It's adults. Thank you very much.